Good morning, guys. Thanks for having me. I appreciate that kind introduction. And yes, I am from that other military academy. You can see a picture of it behind me here at West Point. I currently work there, in fact. But sure. And look, the Air Force was formed from the Army, so let's get that established.
Grandpa, yes.
Well, I will add one other thing though. Behind me is this hat. You see this hat behind me? That's the current duty hat of the sailors that are on the USS Cole serving in the Mediterranean right now, of which my son is an officer on that ship. So I completely failed as an Army parent, having sent my son into the Navy. So
well,
everything's covered.
Okay, I'll just start with a question here just to get you going. Coming from a military background and having watched what transpired in Ukraine in 2014, were you surprised by Putin's invasion now? And was our demonstration of leadership style above the military level during our withdrawal from Afghanistan a factor?
Two parts of that question. First of all, for what we did in Ukraine, there's two ways you can deter a foe from fighting. And that's, number one, create such a great military threat that they wouldn't think of doing that. Or number two, you can then just prepare the battlefield and hope that when the time comes, if they do invade, that you're ready to go. And I think we focused on the second one when it came to Ukraine. We took our eye off the ball. Clearly, he was invading. When you move 120,000 troops to the border on their eastern border, and then you move more into Belarus, into the north there should have been a clear expectation that was going to happen. There was a guy, Talleyrand, once said, there's a lot of things you can do with bayonets, but the last thing you can do is sit on them. So there should have been an expectation. Now, Russia has done this a couple of times. What I think the war in Ukraine is similar to what happened in the Middle East during the 70s, when the Arabs would bring troops to the border of Israel, and they would fake that they were invading, and then finally they once do invade there in the Yom Kippur War in 73. So anyway, to go back to your question, I think that timing was going to happen regardless. That we could argue whether or not that this president and the leadership in this administration had anything to do with it. It might have accelerated it on some level. But that he was preparing this winding up of the Russian fist was taking place long before that really fatal week that took place in Afghanistan, as we tried to withdraw from there and unfortunately losing troops like we did.
Oh, great. Okay. And by the way, you can start lining up for your questions here as well. So I only got like one or two more. Putin wagered that Western response and resolve would quickly disintegrate. Was he right? And have we held up our promises?
Well, he might have been right when we first started this, but it looks like inertia now is taking place. The Russians are stalemated after 6 months or so. And so now the question is whether or not you can wait the West out. You saw weaknesses, I think, coming from some European countries in the last few weeks. But now we are getting out of summer, going into fall, into winter. You know, the question is whether the Western allies can kind of stick together and continue to support Ukraine. There's two issues going to take place there. And the first is, can the Ukraine mount a counteroffensive? Right now, they've lost 1/5 of their landmass. Those are the facts on the ground, and the Russians occupy those. Can the Ukraine military muster enough reserves in order to get that landmass back? Number one. Number two, they're going to have to have help from the West in order for that to take place. We're sending them artillery. We're sending them other means for them to wage war. But what they don't have is manpower. That's going to be the key, as Russia has a continuous supplies. They've reinforced their troops in the last 2 weeks, in fact, in some of those regions that they have there. So the calculation is now, Putin thought he was going to take it quick. It didn't happen. And so now, whether or not, the Ukrainians fought this to a stalemate, they win by not losing. The question is whether or not he can hold out the West for 6 months. Germany's going to have to find alternate energy sources. Look, Donald Trump said it very clearly to Germany when he was president about how dumb it was to outsource your energy. If there's one lesson, couple of lessons in the Ukraine-Russian war right now. The first one is you have to control your airspace. You have to defend your airspace. The fact that Russia doesn't have air superiority over it is pretty amazing still, given the size of its country, and the fact that Ukraine has been able to at least have some air parity with Russia, because that's one way we always fight with our Air Force. But then number two, energy independence, the fact that, you know, the Germans have relied on Russia, Western Europe has put this thing together. That the thought was, if we're all tied together economically, that there would not be conflict. Well, that goes out the window. It's a completely different world than it was from February 24th, 2022, which a lot of people want to go back to, but that world's long gone.
Wow. And then my final one that I have prepared, so it's time for the audience here. The speaker's recent visit to Taiwan, a little bit of shift gears here. How did that change the game board for our strategy in the Pacific?
I'm not sure. I like the fact that we're showing strength doing that. I'm not sure she's the right messenger. I'm not sure that, you know, there's a lot of there that is bigger. That is a bigger tinderbox than what's happening in Europe right now. And I think that when you've got a country, China, that has been waiting to fight for 20 years, really, and they've been watching what the United States does. We're not as strong in the Pacific as we'd like to be. We've got concentrated bases that are there. You've war game out a scenario that if they decided to attack tomorrow, if the Chinese decided to attack Taiwan tomorrow, there's not really a lot we could really do. So I think it's accelerated. You know, I've always said that, you know, World War I starts with, you know, a bullet, a Sophie, a Franz Ferdinand, and next thing you know, the world's at war. Well, that's kind of where we're at right now. I think in the same vein in the Pacific, there's going to be a tripwire someplace that's going to potentially start that. It might be, you know, Taiwan gets surrounded, tries to get landlocked. The question is, you know, will the Chinese actually do something that we just don't expect them to do, and that's attack United States military assets? No one thought, you know, 50, 70 years ago, no one thought that the Japanese would do that to the United States. No one thought Pearl Harbor. No one was that really understood that was going to happen, that it just couldn't perceive it. Same thing with 9/11. 9/11 was created because of lack of creativity on our side. We didn't think that was going to happen. We've got to start getting a little more creative about what could happen in the Pacific. And I think, unfortunately, the speaker's trip might have accelerated. We've already stopped testing ABM missiles, right? So the other thing too is what's going to take place in that if they start a war in the Pacific, what's going to happen is all of the new and first technologies are going to go first, because it's going to be ferocious. You're going to see cyber attacks, hypersonic missiles, a lot of things that are going to you know, really accelerate to whether or not we'll continue to fight, or whether or not Taiwan even capitulates, you know, quickly. So, and a long answer to your question, I think the bottom line is, would have rather have not seen it. I'm not sure why she went. We have a one China policy, and that's what it is. If we buy time to get things out of our supply chain from Taiwan and China over the next few years, that's the smartest thing we could do right now. Because if you look from a fait accompli perspective, for all practical purposes, it's going to be very difficult to start and defend Taiwan, given what's the situation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Great. Wonderful for that. Mark, you're up.
Yes, good morning, and thanks again for talking with us. History's full of examples of how winters in Russia have upended campaigns, and so winter will be here before we know it. And my question is, will that benefit Russia, Ukraine? Will it stop activity, or will this be an opportunity?
Well, the question is whether or not they'll try to keep the land that they have. They've attacked an area, and they control major industrial aspects of where Ukraine is, and agricultural as well. Part of this is the economic statecraft, right? So we put the sanctions on to try to keep Russia down. But Russia now has taken over some places that they can generate revenue from. We saw the steel factory in Mariupol, the chemical factory in Severodonetsk. There's you know, they've acquired assets in this land grab that they've made there. So I'm not sure they're just going to say, okay, good, we're going back to Russia here. This is about boundaries. You know, at the end of the day, conflict and combat is about boundaries that get drawn on the ground. And for right now, Russia has taken a significant amount of revenue capable land and an opportunity that Ukraine once had in the past. I kind of still don't think the last piece is Odessa. If they can grab Odessa, that's along the Black Sea coast there. They own 95% of the land right now that was once Ukraine. If you create a landlocked country of Ukraine, that creates a problem for them, and on a lot of different levels. Think of it, Afghanistan, for example. Afghanistan's a landlocked country. There's not a lot that they're going to be able to produce. Countries have got to produce revenue and have ways to make money. So I don't know. I don't see the Russians stopping. Vladimir Putin is not getting any younger. I think that we fail to put ourselves in their shoes when it's come to this from the very beginning. You had people back 10 years ago saying that if we keep supporting Ukraine like this, they were going to get wrecked, and that's somewhat what happened. The Russians decided to invade. They likely chose a time when they thought that they could get it very quickly, but it just didn't work out that way.
Mike?
Thank you for being here, Major. Speaking question. My question is about Putin's ability to keep a lid on the public knowledge that his own people are exposed to when they control the media, but with the variety, the varied numbers, and the very sheer quantity of numbers of injuries and deaths, how much longer do you think he'll be able to keep that lid on?
He probably has another 6 to 12 months. And I say that based on, in March, he conscripted another 100,000 troops that came online. So Russia has mandatory conscription, 18 to 22, 24. They might have extended that ages. We forget that Russia consists of 11 time zones. I mean, tremendous landmass, 165 or so million people. They have way many more resources than Ukraine does, especially when it comes to people, when it comes to fighting. And so they've conscripted another 100,000. They did that back in March, and in the August-September timeframe, the question is whether or not we see them moving some of those troops into the region. We know they've reinforced. This whole thing started with 180 battle tactical groups. Let's say that's about 150,000 men. Every kind of equipment. What they failed to do is we thought they were going to do shock and awe or blitzkrieg. We thought that they were going to have such overwhelming force that the Ukraine government would have collapsed. And they just didn't attack that way. They attacked across too many fronts. They violated so many different principles of war. But the question is, if they can bring those 100,000 troops, get them online, and to completely outnumber then Ukraine in the south, in the Donbass region, and in Kherson, Mykolaiv, places again where it gets them to get that chance to possibly gain Odessa. That's where I think they'd have to focus on. It just is a matter of whether or not they think that they can throw them in there. He controls the media as it faces eastward, though. If you still watch, Russian media, I've actually appeared on Russian media back in the day at sometimes. He has a lid on that. There's no issue, and that's, he controls that narrative that it goes back to his people. There's no, we can't hope for an underswell of someone's going to take him out, or he's dying of something, or the people are going to revolt. That just doesn't work in these kinds of countries that are led by these kinds of people. I mean, any kind of uprisings that start, they get squashed very quickly. So that's not that method of hope is not a way to think. He could potentially send more troops to this region here in the coming months. We just have to see if he's going to do it or not.
Thank you.
Good morning, Major.
Hi.
This is kind of a general collection of questions, but you read about morale in our armed forces. You read about recruitment being down. You read about cyber. You read about drones. What's the future size and capabilities of our armed forces? Is it going to be in the air? Is it going to be on the ground? What do we look like in the future? I hope that's a fair question.
Yeah, great question. Warfare continues to evolve. Technology has the greatest input on what happens in warfare. For the past 50 years, since the end of the end of the Second World War, the United States has dominated all four major domains: air, land, sea, and space. When it comes to warfare, when it comes to deterring others from attacking us. The fifth domain, though, is cyber, that lies over all of those. And the problem for us is we have peers there, and some of those peers are not even nation state countries. They're literally, like, you hear guys sitting on a couch somewhere hacking into something. So but the future warfare is likely more droned. It's going to be, I still think it comes back to, get there first with the mostest, like that Civil War expression. hypersonic missiles, of which the Chinese have a significant amount of. And that's the fear we have in the Pacific, is the fact that there's so much military assets that they've built up there that we've got to sit there and say, whoa, we're not ready for something here if they decide to launch some kind of attack. What the United States is always good at is responding and the winding up and the whole thing when the time comes. If you look at what we did in Iraq, what we did in Desert Storm, and if our enemy allows us to do that, then if we fight you conventionally, you're going to lose, because there's no other way around it. Our command and control, our commo, our things that go through it, aside from the lethality of our weapon systems. Look at the weapon systems that we put in Ukraine, the artillery in particular. I was a former artillery officer. I fired artillery rounds during the first Gulf War. I saw the impact of how artillery works, and you could see it's working. Now, Russia brings that same mentality to the battlefield, but the difference in this battlefield is back then in the World War II battlefield, where Russia dominated with artillery, it was a mass area fire weapon. If you go 5 square miles, everything in there is dead. We just wipe it out. Today's artillery is more accurate. It's highly precise. It's laser guided, and it results in better results. It results in better things that land on the ground from a military perspective. I think that the United States always has a plan to look over the horizon and what we have to fight for. There's lots of things. The other thing that people don't realize, lots of things we have on the shelf right now that's kind of in testing, that if something happened, all this stuff comes off the shelf and finds its way into the battlefield. You saw the way that we took out al-Zawahiri in Afghanistan with this kind of ninja rocket that really had no kinetic aspect to it, but it literally hit him. I mean, just the fact that the United States can find an individual based on some kind of digital footprint, likely a cell phone. The guy probably had a cell phone in his pocket, right? And can find him, fix him, fire a rocket from 10,000 feet, fire a Hellfire missile, and literally hit him is a pretty decent accomplishment. So, yeah, I don't know. I think that the U.S. The morale's good. I talk to my son. Obviously, he's in the Navy. I work in the military every day. We're putting the best and the brightest still forward. I think that as long as we have good political leaders that give the military missions that are accomplishable, that from their perspective, that has been fixed in our country. We no longer blame the military for the failures of our politicians. We celebrate our veterans. Thank God. We don't blame veterans. We don't blame the soldiers for the failures of our politicians anymore. That's one thing that's changed since really I was in the military. That's kind of the big one. So I think when the time comes, I would rather see us not prepare the battlefield. I would rather see us create a military like we had in the 80s. I'm going to go back here old school a little bit. I would rather see us create a military like the 80s that creates such a deterrence to the rest of the world that says, if you even think about doing something to the United States, you're going to have hell's going to rat so much fury on you, you're not even going to get out of bed in the morning. So that is the kind of that is the kind of military that I think we need to have. We win the Cold War without firing a shot. Back in the 80s, we trained hard. We prepared every day. We were ready to go. And if someone was dumb enough to do something like the Iraqis were in Desert Storm, look what happened. That the 4th largest army in the world was destroyed on the ground in 4 days. So you want to fight us conventionally? That's what's going to happen to you. The question is, the Chinese are going to make a bet here. They're going to gamble on whether or not we have enough military and naval assets, frankly, in the Pacific, I think in the next few years, because they're going to go for Taiwan at some point. That's going to happen. And this guy's as he's leading China, he said it. He said he's not passing it on to the next generation. So that's going to happen. Let's hope we've created a military that tells him, don't even think about it, Joe. It's not going to go your way.
Absolutely.
Do you think that the possibility of a U.S.-China conflict is probably not going to happen because the countries are so tied together economically? China is so dependent on exports and the U.S. is so dependent on imports from China that they're so linked, unlike the U.S. and Russia, which aren't really do a lot of business together.
Yeah, you would think, right? 3,000 Walmarts in America are going to go broke if that supply chain falls, right? So the question is, they're acting differently, though. And whether it also comes down to whether you think China is a rising power or a declining power. And now that's kind of a weird thing to say because they've never they're having internal problems. That this might be the time that they have to do this. The United States is a superpower in the world for two reasons. We got into 2 world wars late. That's frankly it. And we've had, and from sea to shining sea, we have great resources and we have great things and all the things that go with that. Well, these other countries have struggled. I mean, we don't put ourselves, we are so blessed. Those other countries have struggled. Russia, Russia's in the situation they're in right now. In a lot of ways, they thought this was going to be easy for them. But they're a declining power because of their economics. Well, China was trying to be a rising power here, but you read what's happening in there right now, and they've spent so much on their military that this is, the historical analogy that we've seen before is Nazi Germany, right? Really, from what China is, the way they've built up their military. Why do they have to build up their military the way they've done? They're going to do something with it. So I don't know. A rational person would say that they wouldn't do it, but maybe their calculus is if we can punch the United States in the nose hard enough in the beginning and get them to quit and threaten Japan and threaten Australia and basically take over the South China Sea and all the shipping lanes and say, now try to get us. Maybe that's their calculus. I don't know. All I'm saying is we've not prepared from what I've seen enough of a military in that region that's been enough of a deterrence, which is where we have to focus on right now.
Chris.
All right, another question. What do you think the potential for nuclear conflict is?
So what I found in people talking about that in Ukraine is, the Russians can have a nuclear weapon. And if they use it, everyone think, they're believing that would be the case. That would change the calculus of everything, because and for example, this is also why we can't let the Iranians get a nuclear weapon or the Saudis get a nuclear weapon. I mean, because that's maybe the other lesson of this. First of all, Ukraine never had nuclear weapons. They were in possession of the ones that were in the former Soviet Union. So when they got rid of their weapons in '93, that was just more like maintenance, more like just as it was a good, kind of a good thing to do. China has nuclear weapons. We have nuclear weapons. If China decided to use a low-grade nuclear weapon, I just don't know. No one's kind of gone down that rabbit hole. It would be the end of mutually assured destruction as a way of deterrence. I will. So I've always, I keep talking about deterrence, right? I'm willing to give the next Nobel Peace Prize to the next thing, the next person that comes up with what's going to deter these countries from doing what they're doing. Russia wasn't deterred in Ukraine, so it wasn't the economics of it. What's going to keep China from possibly not attacking Taiwan? Is it the nuclear thing? I don't know. I think we should lead with that because that's really what it's been before. Because it will result in potentially an escalation that we just can't see. Now, North Korea. So if North Korea's nuclear capability is regional, but the problem is Seoul is so close to the border there, they could literally push a nuclear weapon across the border and it would be a problem, right? But North Korea doesn't really threaten us. They don't have a space program. In order to be threatened by a country in another hemisphere, you have to have a space program, satellites, in order to launch a nuclear weapon to have any kind of reliability that's going to hit. Because I was also a nuclear weapons officer when I was in the Army. So no one's really thought this kind of through. And I think that you wouldn't see China do it because they know it would mean an escalation that we would likely go to. And we still could potentially, we'd have a few more things that we could play. Which is why I still think we have mutually assured destruction fundamentally at that level when it comes to nuclear weapons.
Jenny.
Returning to the assassination of Zawahiri.
Yeah.
Was it strategic or symbolic?
Probably both. Maybe more symbolic. Look, I was in New York City at 9/11. I know a lot of 9/11 family members, a lot of soldiers that fought in that war. And I could tell you this, that there's a lot of people on USS Cole. So for example, Zawahiri is responsible for that mission as well. There's a memorial on the Cole. I've seen it for the sailors that were killed on that. And I could tell you those guys that night and gals that were on that ship were celebrating. Look, we could my only thing that crosses my mind when we do stuff like that is eventually some other country is going to have that capability. Some other country is going to have the ability to, take a ship in the Potomac and fire it and put a round in the White House and put a round in the middle of the Lincoln Memorial or something. It's going to happen. It's an eventuality that we have to recognize. But it was a lot symbolic, but it does show that we're still willing to go after you no matter what, and make sure that you're going to pay for that. It is that guy was 70-something years old, more or less a figurehead controlling a very weakened Al-Qaeda. That's the other thing. So there are many people in the world whose sole purpose in life is to keep you afraid of the world and the boogeyman because it generates revenue for them. Well, I personally think that this is the way that the terrorist groups work. We have to be careful. The things we have in place since 9/11 are tremendous, but Al-Qaeda is not the threat to the homeland that it once was. We have bigger problems in our homeland, cyber. We have much bigger issues that we have to deal with. Someone will take over his place, and that guy will get targeted too. Somebody got paid for this. Maybe we could see money. All of a sudden, we see money going into the Taliban. We could see the Taliban was involved with that. The fact that he was like hiding in plain sight. But to me, it was strategic from the perspective of we showed the world that, we created an assassination weapon when you think about it. That I still can't get over that Hellfire missile that we fired at him that was non-kinetic, that was able to hit him from 10,000 feet. That's a pretty good feat. So, but I'll give it to you. It was probably more symbolic. But if you ask a 9/11 family member, the folks I talk to and the people I know, they're good riddance.
Ryan.
Mike, I'd like to just correlate your comment about Putin just putting more troops into the southeast of Ukraine, contrasted with the comment about the effectiveness of our technology. So that my logic says that no matter how many people Russian soldiers, if you got the proper equipment. So where does the confusion lay? Is it in the American public? Are we committed with winning in Ukraine? Is that where the weakness is, that we will debate it to death and end up doing nothing and losing interest? Where do you see the future?
Well, I think we can't put troops there. I think the administration has threaded a very good needle when it's come to this war. The amount of money that we've put there, the Ukraine military defense budget in previous years was $15 to $20 billion. We've given them 60 to 70 billion already. I mean, they have a blank check. The Ukraine military has a blank check. They know it, but it's like everything else. They can't necessarily use it. They need an army. They need people. So you asked the question about troops, right? So there was an old guy named Fehrenbach that made this expression that said you can fly over land, you could pulverize it, you could atomize, you could do all things, but you can't keep it unless you have people. You have to put, like the Roman legions did, you have to put troops in the mud and go get it. So that's what I did. I was in the mud, right? And that's what Ukraine just doesn't have and what Russia could have. The question is, the technology has made it such that how many people you got to put in the mud, right? In the past, you would have to attack with ratios of 3 to 1, 2 to 1 in order to assure victory. Well, the technology has now made it that Russia needs more people. They need 5 to 1, 6 to 1. They need a lot more people. And that's the calculus that's taking place of whether they want to expend that or not. Now, as for the United States supporting it, I think Europe is getting healthy. I think the Germans have woken up now. They've started to send equipment. They recognize that they can't buy Russian energy. They've got to become more energy independent. I was never in favor of a lot of these countries joining NATO. Frankly, going back under Obama and under Bush, I never thought it was a good idea. We shouldn't have in the past. We couldn't have had NATO as everybody but Russia, because that's how the First World War was caused. The First World War was caused of these crazy alliances that took place. That, again, Sophie, a bullet, Franz Ferdinand, bang, next thing you know, Germany, Russia, everybody's at war. I mean, it's just crazy. However, world's changed since February 24th. So now Finland, NATO, with a combined total of 15 million people, of which both militaries have been operating interoperability with NATO already. We do things with NATO. We do with them all the time. So now that's different. And in the past, for example, you put the Baltics in NATO. The Baltics are a tripwire country. But they're all in, right? They're investing more than their GDP. That's because they know it's survival. Same with Poland. The world's going to look different on Poland right now for the amount of things that they've supported. So when this finally kind of dies off, what's going to happen is the old Europe countries of France and Germany are going to be diminished. And you're going to see these Eastern European countries, Romania, Poland, Sweden, Finland, and the Baltics. And so a lot of those countries are going to be taking the lead militarily. And this is going to be good for the army, for our army, because instead of going to Germany now, we're going to be much more forward deployed. So I still believe that we are doing all we can because we don't want to send troops. We don't want to make this a NATO fight in particular. And I'm surprised that mistake hasn't been made yet. I'm surprised there hasn't been some spillover someplace. But I think both sides have tiptoed around it. The Russians got to be careful because the Russians don't want to fight NATO. The Russians don't want to go there. They're barely holding their own against the country that they should have run over 4 months ago. And if all of a sudden we introduce NATO could get probably 60,000 troops into Ukraine within 2 weeks, aside from air cover, aside from all the other things that we bring to the table, command and control, all those things. I mean, we're killing Russian generals because we're telling the Ukraine military where they are, and they're precisely hitting them with drones and pinpoint weapons. If you multiply that by 10, which is what NATO would do, the conflict would be over pretty quickly. So that's why Russia has not done anything to really make sure NATO's in the fight. And we don't want to be in the fight. I don't want to send troops there. That's not something that we want to start, because that could start a much bigger land war.
Cool, thank you. We only have time for about one, maybe two more questions. Rich?
Okay, I'll only ask 4 or 5. I did a quick comment. You're talking about where the fighting is now and looking at it historically. Yeah, the idea, one, that Europe is so unified, but also Sweden and Finland are in NATO. The idea that the conflict for Russia is in eastern Ukraine, that goes so against several hundred years of their history of wanting buffers in. We forget, prior to World War I, Warsaw was part of Russia, the Russian Empire. Their border has moved way east, and historically the Russians do not like that. But the question I have, you talked about the industrial areas in eastern Ukraine. The Russian then Soviet army and policymakers have a lovely post-World War II history of all the areas they occupy, stripping all anything that can move or be disassembled and moved in terms of factories, anything industrial, and bringing it east into Russia proper. One, have we seen anything like that happening this time? And two, do you think that would be a predicate to Russia conceivably pulling back out of Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I don't think we've seen it yet, because it's just so chaotic on the ground as Russia is trying to, really hold its own. We've not seen kind of that in mass before. We saw that in the 90s when Russia was pulling out of places like Czechoslovakia and East Germany. They were stripping the bathrooms of pipes. I remember getting intel reports. They were literally gutting buildings and taking everything back to Russia at the time. I struggle with Russian culture, right? I mean, and what I say by that is, the fact they're killing civilians, the fact that, that's a reflection of their society. It's a reflection of humanity. I struggle with the fact that their leaders and their military just throw their privates and sergeants into these battles, and this equipment is awful. I can show you pictures of the tanks. You can see the picture of the tanks with the tops blown off them. I struggle with Russian culture, but it's one of that. It's one of doing things when the time comes. I don't think they're there, but when the time comes, that's what we have to watch out for. Ukraine is going to have to just take what losses they have and rebuild what we have. The thing about it is back in the day of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had all the smart people, right? All the nuclear plants were there, right? Chernobyl is there. There's another nuclear plant that's there right now that the Russians are about to blow up because they just don't know how to run it. They're just dumb, right? So there's an intellectual capital that exists in Ukraine, in their culture, right? In their culture. Now, I hope to not insult anybody in the crowd who's Russian. I get it. But you can't help but notice these tendencies that when you see of how these cultures run. And I'm very grateful in our country that our military doesn't have, for example, we would never do that to our military. We design equipment. If there's one thing I got out of going to war as a young man, it's our equipment is second to none. And it's designed to protect the force, and it's survivable. And when you feel invincible in a combat zone, it's no match. Let me tell you, you're going to do great things. I guarantee no Russian soldier feels that way in the crap that they're running around. Right. So that mentality is in our country. That's not there. It is what it is. I'm not trying to insult anybody. I don't want to go there. But the point is, I'm very grateful for that.